Kia ora, welcome everyone to the Wellington and Auckland Behavioural Economics Network. The session, we're blessed with a wider audience, so we have people who've joined us from Australia, the UK, India, South Africa, and a few other parts of the world. Shout out if I missed your country in the comments. And we're super grateful to have our guest speaker today. We have Juliette, who's joined us from Sydney. Juliette has a PhD in experimental psychology from the University of Cambridge. She's one of 60 Australian women nominated as a superstar in STEM and has worked in some of the leading behavioral science units across the world. She's worked in the Behavioural Insights team and the Commonwealth Bank team, as well as at Ogilvy Change, and she was my counterpart in the Sydney office when I was heading the Wellington practice. So we're super pleased and super grateful to have you with us, Juliette.
Thank you.
Just from the top, just a broad overview of some of the topics which we're hoping to discuss, and we'd love for the conversation to happen organically, and any comments and questions in the chat, we'll pick them up too. The three things which we're hoping to cover in conversation are some of the challenges which we're facing in lockdown as we transition to this new normal. We're also going to be talking about some of the behavioral strategies, both for well-being and resilience. Something which has been top of mind is thinking about how these strategies can lead to a lasting change. So we're going to have a chat about how might we embed these practices to create a lasting change. Starting off with challenges that we're facing in lockdown, something which I've been facing in particular as a challenge is starting a conversation with someone. I know there's some sensitivity, and there's been some commentary going around with people feeling tired about being constantly asked about how they're feeling, and emails about, the health of our well-being, the health of our family. And it seems to be stressing people out to constantly answer these questions. At the same time, we are going through we're in the midst of a pandemic, a historical moment. It's impacting our livelihoods, it's impacting our health, it's impacting our well-being. So it's impossible not to have these conversations and check in with each other at these times. Juliette, do you have any suggestions in terms of how we start conversations at these times, and how do we check in with people?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and there is no perfect way to some extent, but there are two things that I think about here. One is the sensitivity around loss in identities, with people starting to lose their jobs now. So how can we start to ask people other questions that might be meaningful about to them, or ask them a question that isn't just like, hi, what do you do, right, at a basic level, but rather ask people what they're interested in, or something like that, right? So a little bit more sensitive to different topics, but also a way that can remind people of the value of their other identities that isn't just work, which is what we often kind of quite get stuck on. The other thing that I can think about is when we're reaching out to people, it's really useful to reach out and make sure that you are available and you're open to chat and have that transparency, and right up front think about the way that you might want to have that interaction. But then you don't always have to follow up unless you are specifically concerned about somebody. And then with a lot of the mental health research, it often does say it's sometimes really useful just to have an open conversation. And while someone might not be ready to talk about their problems at that time, it might not go well for you, it's still opening up that ability to have that conversation. There's less stigma around it because you're actually just being honest and judgment-free to some extent, versus beating around the bush, so to speak. When we're all humans, we're very often interacting with each other a lot, so we can tell when things are a little bit off, or if people want to, we can often tell if things are a little bit off and people want to kind of ask us something that they're not. So it's quite useful to, as I said, think about how people might define themselves other than their job identity, then think about really setting up that ability to have open communication and transparency from the beginning, and only if you can follow through with it and you honestly want to kind of, or have the ability to be there with other people. Otherwise, it's useful to kind of direct them in to certain areas, and then again have that really open, honest conversation if you're worried about somebody, and don't feel uncomfortable if that doesn't necessarily always go the way that you wish the first time. Sometimes it takes people a while to open up, or you're not the person that they wish to open up to potentially.
Awesome answer. I was listening to the Freakonomics podcast last week, and there was an episode titled Reasons to be Cheerful. And we're in the midst of so much negative information around us, and there's not enough which we find to be cheerful about. The lead singer of Talking Heads, David Bryan, has put up a website called Reasons to be Cheerful, and he only publishes positive news and stories. So his tagline is "Tonic for Tumultuous Times," and he's been covering topics such as how have we been expressing acts of kindness with each other these times. So he's stripped down some of that negative information. I did come across some research from Pew, which suggested it was US data, but 66% of adults are actually quite worn out of the news, and 50% of social media users are worn out of having political discussions in the news. And there's a lot of negativity, I suppose, circulating in the media. Personally, my strategy has actually been to spend more time in the media and read up as much as possible. But I'm quite aware that as humans, we do have a negativity bias. So the impact of bad things weighs on us far more than good things, what Kahneman refers to as loss aversion. So having $50 wiped out of your profits in the stock exchange is going to hurt you far more than gaining $50 in value, which you've gained. What are your thoughts in terms of how we engage with information today? Should we spend less time reading about things, or should we not be worried at all in terms of our media consumption?
Yeah. I think there are individual differences in the advice that I would give, or how you're feeling. But you're right. So there's also like a kind of evolutionary perspective theory that suggests that we focus on the negative aspects so that we can kind of learn and from that, right? And they're the things that we generally have to learn from the most, is some of this. So there is a good... it's useful to be reading the media and be aware of the risk to some extent, but if it is obviously causing you a lot of anxiety or feelings of just uncertainty, then there are sort of strategies that you can use. So it may be taking time, and we'll probably go into some of these kind of ideas more, but just there is sometimes about like just taking the time to calm your mind and step away from the media. You can think about the language that you're using, and also thinking through some of the ways that you're thinking through a lot of this. So there's some research around what's called post-traumatic growth, which is opposite of post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And what that means is if you actually think that you can get through a crisis, then you're much more likely to get through that crisis and be more resilient, versus if your mindset is quite if you don't feel that you can get through a crisis and you don't feel that you're kind of going to get through it, then actually you're more likely to get PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's really interesting to try and change your mindset to be somewhat more optimistic through this time, in terms of you will get through it. There will come a time to some extent, and there are some other tactics that we can go through, some kind of mental and behavioural tactics, just for better resilience in general.
Before we get to that, do you have thoughts in terms of what should we be worried about now? So what's our biggest challenge which we are facing? So I did mention a survey which I came across on the BBC website, and mental well-being, it was a survey with about 1,000 people, and it reported that mental well-being has gotten worse since the pandemic started. And there's been a disruption to routines that keep people safe and well. So people have actually been seeking out less help at these times, less regular help at these times, but seeking out more emergency help, and that's quite a worrying signal to me. Another aspect which I spoke about at our last session was social isolation and loneliness, and the impact of physical distancing. What's the impact of that in our communities? The fact that we're less connected with those around us. What do you see some of our biggest challenges in the space of well-being?
Definitely just mental well-being in general, right? So thinking about, there are obviously a lot of people now that are experiencing job loss, or also just have experienced for a period of time where now there's financial well-being has declined, and that actually can link into then how you feel about your yourself and your mental health, and then also your mental health can again link into your financial well-being. So there's that side of things. There's also just the general uncertainty. People don't really know what's coming, and I think we've been in such a market where we've had a really strong economy and kind of all this certainty going, and it's increasing by year, and now all of a sudden it's this really uncertain period where we're not sure of what's going to happen even over the next kind of 6 months to a year. The other thing that I think is quite interesting for people, particularly who still have jobs as well, is the mental, so it's linked to this kind of isolation, but the kind of mental exhaustion that comes from working from home and being able to understand how to switch off and also how to take breaks. So if you're working from home, which I think most of us are, you might actually feel more exhausted now, a few weeks in, because we're not actually getting the time between meetings to get up and take a 5-minute walk to the next meeting. It's much more difficult to switch off. So actually taking care of our mental health and at home is also really important, and will be another potential challenge moving forward.
Mm-hmm. To get some context, what is well-being, and should we set what we mean by well-being and being well, and why is it important for us to be having this conversation?
Definitely. So I guess well-being broadly is kind of a sense of feeling like you're living a happy, satisfying and fulfilling life. But within that, you can have financial well-being, you can have mental well-being, which is kind of something that we're kind of more focusing on physical, and it's all related. There's even now looking at kind of environmental well-being, where if you feel safe in your community and you feel also, that you're contributing to environmental factors. Intellectual well-being as well, thinking about, are you challenged at your work? And so lots of different factors of well-being, and all of those will change depending on you as a person and how you feel. So do you currently feel happy with your current level of well-being in all aspects?
Mm-hmm. I came across something which delighted me, and it's that it was from Dr. Laurie Santos. She's put up a wonderful course on the science of well-being, and she covered some of her topics were around why happiness actually has very little to do with external circumstance. So having a good job really doesn't make us as happy as we think it will. So people overpredict or overestimate how happy a dream job will make them. Similarly, there's work done by Daniel Kahneman and Angus Deaton in the space of emotional well-being and income. So having an increase in a salary beyond its US data, beyond $75,000 doesn't improve our well-being. So beyond that level, whether we get a pay rise or not, it doesn't really impact our well-being. But also being cognitively aware of any money being taken away from us is going to hurt us at these times. So it's worth paying careful attention to what factors actually impact us. One of the factors which has really stood out to me is Well, she pointed true love in her example. So some of the good news of things which actually improves your well-being is true love. So most people had reported an increase in happiness after 2 years, but that only stays for 2 years and it falls back to the baseline. So even true love in the long run doesn't really improve your well-being. I'd love to hear your insights in terms of well-being comes from, where does well-being and happiness come from?
Yeah, so happiness is definitely, it's not, we're very bad at predicting at times what makes us happy versus what we find is it's more experimental, right? So most people are not born with a passion. It's you find it along the way, and then and the movies, it frustrates me at times when I watch movies and it's always about, chasing happiness, and at the end they get this job and then all of a sudden they're happy. What the research sort of tells you is that's not the case. It's more of a mindset that makes you happy, and the way of kind of thinking, but also what you're talking about with social connections. So the more kind of connections that you have, that you feel kind of supported, generally the better your well-being. Also sometimes how you compare yourself to others. So if you're often interacting with other people that, if we think about a financial sense, have a lot more money for you or something like that, that can actually impact your well-being to some extent. So it's just about really having the right social support, the right kind of having the right mindset about this is, being a bit more optimistic and self-compassionate, and also not kind of chasing happiness, but kind of finding it through what you do. So and in the moments.
Mm-hmm. Shane did ask a question. Shane, that's Dr. Laurie Santos. She has a course on Coursera called The Science of Wellbeing. I highly recommend the course. Something she also talks about in the course is hedonic adaptation, and that's the whole idea of us getting more accustomed to positive and negative stimuli, and something to help overcome some of the hedonic adaptation. So if you have so if you get your dream job, if you get buy your dream car, or if you go on that nice walk, which you've the nice trek which you've always wanted to do, it's worth practicing the art of savoring. So spending a bit more time in that experience, cherishing that experience. Something which I have been telling people or advising people at this time is to actually formulate 3 very rigid memories at this point of time. So the way our long-term memories work in the brain is we're going to encode this COVID-19 lockdown period as something which is going to stay very strong with us, and chances are you might remember this 10 years down the line or 15 years down the line. So it's well worth encoding 3 memories at this point of time, 3 experiences which have stood out to you. And 15 years later, when you look back at the lockdown days, you'll have 3 nice things to remember and 3 nice things to feel happy about.
Yeah, it's interesting because our memory is generally pretty reconstructive. So like what you'll find is even when you go on a really terrible holiday, over time, when people ask you, you'll start to say it was okay, it was good. And then so actually we kind of change the way we view things in the future anyway. But the other way to think about this is so when I was talking before about the post-traumatic stress disorder or whatnot, so when we actually go through a crisis, we often think things are very personal, so that I've lost my job because of me. They're very pervasive, so we think that the crisis will affect all of our life, and even if you've done something wrong in your work life, you think that that's impacting your friendships and whatnot as well. So very pervasive, and then permanent. So we think that the moment will last forever to some extent, or the feelings might last forever. If you've ever thought about moving overseas and it seems like a big decision, but you never actually think about, oh, hold on, I could come home or something. You think more long term around. So that might help you think about that permanent thinking. So again, if in the moment, so you were talking about if you look back or if you write it down and look back in the future, you might remember these memories. But some things to do too is when those negative thoughts, you can kind of change them now and think, hey, hold on, this isn't going to last forever. You know, even if it's just another year, I'm going to get through this. These are the ways I can. Just start to change your thinking. It's not my fault. There's nothing I can do. People are going through it together. So that's that personal, the pervasiveness. You know, while I might have lost my job, I've got my friends still and they're great. I've got my family and now I'm, you know, becoming a great mother or father, you know, reaching out to my family more. So that side of things. And then that, again, permanence is, this isn't something that is going to last together, last a long time.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's such a rich insight. So what's the secret? Tell us. So how do we thrive at these times? What are the mental and behavioral strategies which we can adopt?
Yeah, definitely. So the strategies that I'm going to talk about are pretty broad at the moment, but we can kind of delve into more later as well. But so one of the there are kind of three different strategies I think about: unhelpful strategies, mindset type strategies, again, which we've touched on a little bit, and then these kind of behavioural strategies, so to speak. So the unhelpful strategies are the emotional avoidance. So when we're really stressed, we're going to go to the kitchen and we're going to eat too much, or we've increased our alcohol use. These kind of behaviours that in the short term at times can be effective. So or that night, it's going to relieve your feelings of anxiety and uncertainty, but long term it's really not useful, and it's going to lead to poorer outcomes than some of the other strategies that we think about. But I always think it's useful to think about that emotional avoidance because we can all be very, very guilty of that. The other thing is surface acting, and this is when you are putting on a happy face, but you're not necessarily like lifting your emotions to feel that. So this is often what will happen when you might experience burnout and you're really not happy kind of internally, but you're trying to put on a happy face. And again, these are things that in the day-to-day, once off or every so often, if you use this, it can be an effective strategy to get through the day. But shifting that strategy to more adaptive ones is obviously more useful. Over time, we will get kind of burnout and whatnot. So in terms of mindset, if we can go through those, one thing we talked about is the learned optimism. So this is from kind of Seligman. So that's if we can change the way we think about permanence, pervasiveness and personalisation when we're going through a crisis, that can be really, really useful. The other one is having that bit of a growth mindset, which is the Carol Dweck kind of work. Again, this is kind of linked to that learned optimism, but is thinking about how you can see your situation and growing from it and building skills or whatnot, versus kind of having that fixed mindset where you feel like you're stuck in a place, your skills and abilities aren't going to be able to grow. So just taking a more kind of growth outlook on terms of things. Also, one really key thing at the moment is just being self-compassionate. So realising in the moment that it's okay to feel whatever emotions you're feeling, and actually often when we're more self-compassionate, this is kind of getting into those, this is kind of coming from the work around the surface acting and whatnot, when we actually become more self-compassionate with ourselves and release the emotions and let ourselves feel, we often bounce back better from times of crisis. And then the last kind of mindset type strategy, which Vishal, you touched on before, is thinking about gratitude. So how can we think through what makes us most happy, or what we're most grateful for? So there are a range of work on this in terms of the best way to do this, but it might be just before you go to bed, thinking about 3 or 4 things that you're really grateful for throughout the day. If you journal, then that can be a really effective way of tracking that. Journaling is a great behavioural strategy to get through times of crisis, or even just in general, and to track our feelings and our emotions, because we can see it over time. It gives us kind of that food for thought.
I love your insight in terms of being more compassionate to our own feelings, and some of it stems from the Buddha's teaching about when we have a feeling, let's not ignore it, and to try and understand if you've experienced it before. Have you felt this strange feeling before, whether it's a negative or a positive feeling? Just taking the time off to recognize that the feeling does exist, and the attention to this feeling is that's where the healing process begins, as part of the Buddhist teaching, which has been embedded very well into compassionate inquiry.
Definitely. And also the self-compassion for others as well. So like everyone's going to react to this differently, and we're not sure. So really being compassionate about the time that people require, which actually I think COVID-19 has been really useful for, because everyone's forced to work from home and now children at home. So everyone is literally forced to work very differently and accept that to some extent, but just really useful to think back through, especially when we're coming out of lockdown, how people will feel about certain areas and the interaction there.
I did like your idea of also not, it was summed up in a TED talk, in a podcast, which I listened to quite recently, but it's okay to feel not okay right now. We are going through very difficult times, and I think if we can accept that things are not okay, that's fine, and we're just getting by and just surviving these times is good enough, and that's something which we don't give enough credit to ourselves for.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's the time to give yourself permission again to disconnect from your work identity at times. So, okay, I haven't done much work today, but I've actually got to spend time with my family, or I've actually just given myself some time to think. And actually, when we take a little bit of a break, we know that boosts. So Adam Grant's kind of work looks at like boosting creativity around that, or actually a little bit of procrastination if you've thought about something and then you procrastinate for a little while. That actually stems more greater creativity and productivity. So that's his kind of original book. It's called The Originals. But so it's just a time to, again, be compassionate if you don't, and whilst you might sort of progress more slowly, it's also thinking about those different identities and giving yourself rewards in all aspects, not just in your career.
Mm-hmm. Another insight which I had picked up from Dr. Gabor Mate's work, he's putting up some amazing material out there and appeared in a few podcasts too. And it sort of stemmed from the initial conversations which we were having around toilet paper, for example, and conversations which also went on to, in terms of alluding to, are we being too judgmental of each other at these times? And there's been cases of people actually buying disinfectants or buying face masks, hoarding them and price gouging and making profit at this time. Horrible, right? Who would do that, right? And there are two ways of asking those questions. So there's one way of asking that question is, what's wrong? Who the hell would do that? What's wrong with these people? Why are they price gouging? Why are they ripping people off? The second question you can ask is, who would do that? Like, who would actually have to do that? Who would be so disconnected from community, from people around them, from suffering from anxiety, who suffers that much that they need to sell face masks or toilet paper to profit at these times? And that really turns the table around and gives us, I guess, a lens of thinking more compassionately about how we accept each other at these times.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It is a real period of experimentation and huge changes in human behaviour. So as you said, like most of us know here the difference between being very rational and irrational, and this is putting many people into a highly hot, irrational state where they might be behaving in ways that they're just trying to manage their anxiety or manage the uncertainty that's coming in the best way that they can. And even though it might be perceived as ethically unfair, we don't really know what's happening and what's kind of behind that. Another thing that's really interesting is thinking about some of the shifts in mental health that will be happening from, if we think of addiction standpoint. now that we have for a long period of time casinos that are shutting down, what's the shift there in people's behaviour, which is really interesting from an addiction and mental health point of view. Are we seeing that those who usually gambled in casinos are moving online too? Is it that they're now shifting completely? If they are going online, then we have much more sort of tracking information to understand the addiction and behaviour. So habit change is something else. I saw a really funny meme the other day that said, I now can't blame my lack of productivity on if only I had more time or if I wasn't so busy. I thought that was quite funny in thinking back our kind of rationalizations about things. So again, what habits and good and bad habits are we establishing through this time, and what will we keep and what won't we keep at the end of this? So will we just kind of revert back to normal, or is there going to be kind of lasting changes? And that's something that we can all hypothesize about, but time will tell.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm quite curious on this, I guess, subject of habit and changes which have happened to us at this point of time. So there's been a forced withdrawal of a lot of things in our lives. So gambling's being taken out, but also we have things like sports, which is no longer running on television, which was a major source of entertainment, but also a major source of distraction from what's going on in ourselves. We have pubs which have been shut down. We have coffee shops which have been taken away. So a lot of, and we've been having to spend a lot more time with ourselves, with our families, with our kids, which has been turbulent for some, with their partners, and that's posed challenges on relationships. And it's almost given us, I suppose, a blessing and a curse. I like to look at it as a blessing. We've been given this opportunity for distraction being taken away from our lives, and an opportunity for personal growth, an opportunity to connect with others. And if we spend enough time paying attention to these things and discover things which work, building relationships with people we've neglected for a long period of time, it's something which we can carry forward in a post-COVID world. Do you have any thoughts in terms of what hacks can we use from behavioral science to cultivate some of these habits into our everyday lives?
Yeah, so there's a range, and one thing I would say is during this time is first take the time to calm. Like, it's a key opportunity to calm our minds, whether or not it's through practicing kind of mindfulness, journaling, as we spoke about before. There's some research around the state of flow that talks about even engaging in kind of small but challenging tasks can calm our mind and set us into kind of a kind of state of flow, so to speak. So again, just a relaxation. So I think this is a perfect opportunity for us to all take a break and think about where we're going, what we want to do, and like just permission to not have to perform to some extent, right? Just for a period of time, and maybe not perform is the best way. But then it's also about thinking about what is your habitual behaviour. So establishing new routines, whether or not that's linking cueing, adapting kind of some of your old routines with new ones that you want to adapt. So the best way I think about this is I was recently working with a pharmacist, and they talk about when they give people medication on a daily basis, they say put it next to your toothpaste, because brushing your teeth is a very established kind of habit. And so when you go to brush your teeth, you'll see your medication. And as a kind of a behavioural scientist, this is very obvious, but it's not something that I've really read not reread, but haven't seen any recommendations to even think about putting it next to really basic things like your toothbrush or your toothpaste. So what can you harness other habits to build new ones? Can you get accountability partners where if you want to actually achieve new new tasks, or even go for walks, have people that hold you accountable to that, and you hold them accountable to their activities, so that you can do that together. Also seek help when you need to, and I don't even mean that as a seek like help for in terms of services, but hey, like throw it out there. This is a time where people are being a little bit more altruistic in their way of thinking. So if you really want to establish new skills or habits, it's actually putting it out there and seeing who can help you with that as well.
I've recently, downloaded.
There, as I said, really broad ones.
I've downloaded a habit tracker app. I have picked up a few good habits at this point of time, and I was a bit worried that I'm going to let these habits go. So I have it just as a reminder, and I think somewhere unconsciously it impacts me, that the fact that I've not done my 30-minute run, or not done a breathing exercise in the morning, and just the fact that I'm tracking my own habits is a way of just the fact that I'm measuring myself is almost like a impact on its own in terms of changing my own behavior.
Yeah, the other thing is to have in-time reminders, which is very useful. So I actually know someone at the Behavioural Insights team, they used to, on their watch, have a vibration that would go off 5 minutes before the end of a meeting. And that gives you actual tactile reminder also, as opposed to your kind of your visual notification that you might get on your computer. So that's another way of thinking about incorporating, if you've got any kind of tactile ways of reminding yourself. It just gives you another touch point, so to speak. So I can't see the bottom of the question, but finding it hard. So I find it hard to leave my computer at sometimes. Yeah, this is going to be a really tough one, and is something that everybody is struggling with. So one part is around, which is trying to remind yourself, or B, as said, have kind of accountability partners. If you've got people that you live with, go out and actually make sure you schedule time with them to even get outside and walk and do that. The other thing is trying to separate your day. So can you have your workspace in a location that isn't necessarily, say, close to the places that you might relax, like your TV or your bedroom? Can be really difficult. So that's just kind of one suggestion. The other thing is around actually taking a break. So when you finish work, there's some recommendations around walking outside and going even around the block, or driving around the block, so it feels like you've finished your day, and then you can start again. You can kind of wind down from the day. So just disassociating your work day from your home day. Another area I really like is this kind of embodied, enclothed cognition, it's called. So enclothed cognition, and it is just when you go to work, you get up and you stick to the same routine as you would. So you have your shower, you get ready into your work clear, and then you sit down, and that puts you in the state to work. When you finish, you go off, you would do the same activity, take off your work clothes, and again, you're then separating or kind of chunking your life into different areas. One other thing to think about is just planning, and as I just said then too, like chunking your day or your week into certain activities, so that you can remember to have some thinking time, have some meeting time, but also have some time with your family, with your if you're doing sort of exercise and whatnot. So break down those goals and think ahead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the Apple Watch has a very nice reminder asking you to breathe, and you can set it as you like. A lot of people have been doing that wrong. So when someone asks you to take a deep breath, a lot of people don't take a deep breath the right way. So there's a whole science behind nose breathing and the impact of nose breathing. And when we take a deep breath, a lot of the instinct is to actually take a breath with the mouth, which is not very helpful. And so the helpful way of breathing and calming yourself down is to take a deep breath through the nose and start with the belly and move upwards to the chest and then to the head. and that deep breath can have a big impact. So taking that deep breath can be quite big, but I guess it's also how taking the right deep breath.
Yeah, so there's some the recommendations, particularly when we're feeling anxious, around what's called a box breath. So if you breathe out for 4 seconds and like hold it for 4 seconds, and it's hard, breathe in for 4 seconds and take the 4 seconds and then hold it for 4 seconds. And then if you do that about 10 times, that should actually help with your breathing and making yourself a little bit more conscious. And the hold pattern itself makes you take in more air because so it's actually quite hard to do it at times, but really useful. So it's a tactic when I worked with a speaking coach for a while, and it was something that when I first started doing more public speaking, I found really useful, just half an hour before I went on, just to kind of calm myself. But it is something that I know a lot of people also recommend for just a range of different kind of states that make you feel anxious.
Does anyone have any habits or tricks which they share with us? Please let us know. Something which I like to practice as a breathing technique is the Wim Hof method. He's quite popular on YouTube now, but something to start the day by. So you start with 30 of those deep breaths. So not just once. You do one inhale, and you exhale through your nose or through your mouth, but you inhale through your nose, and you do 30 of those deep breaths, and you don't let all the air out, and you keep more breath in. So you what you practice is very similar to what free divers would practice, and you kind of hyperventilate through the time. And at the end of it, Wim Hof talks about the value of breath hold as much as the value of taking a breath. So and what you do at the end of the 30 breaths is to hold your breath for as long as you're comfortable with. Your advice not to do it while driving or swimming or in a swimming pool, because you can pass out. The 30 deep breaths, if you do it right, you do get a bit of dizziness. It's kind of like you get like a body high. His tagline is to get high on your own supplies, so you can get this high out of breathing. So you don't do it while driving or when you're in a swimming pool, but you feel it flowing through through your body. And he's climbed mountains in his shorts. He's also known as the Iceman. So he's performed these incredible feats, and a lot of what he's been able to achieve is just from his practice of breathing.
I think Katie Milkman's temptation to bundling is also really useful for setting habits, and that's just that something that you don't want to do, you couple with something that you really enjoy. So it might be that you really want to watch Netflix, but you've got to do it on the treadmill. Or for me, I love coffee, and so I do not have my first coffee unless I'm sitting down to work. And then that over time has just been like kind of the way that I temptation bundle. So that would be another kind of really useful strategy that I use, or makes you feel better when you're getting kind of 2 tasks done, but also enjoying the process more.
Mm-hmm. So what are you listening to these days? Any books, any podcasts, any thinkers that we can listen to for inspiration at these times?
Yeah, so one thing that I think is really useful is the Yale course, which you already just mentioned, about just thinking about happiness and wellness. I also really like kind of the work around achieving a flow state. So by Seligman and I can never say his last name, but Chilwans. I'll write it. It's a really long last name. I just think that there will also be a really amazing amount of work that comes out of the next year with all of the funding that's going into mental health. So it would be something where I say, really kind of watch this space and see. It's the first time on like a kind of global level, we've been really kind of impacted maybe when we've got data, right? We've got a bit of ability of data on a kind of global scale to measure this and actually see the changes that occur.
Yeah, it's amazing to have sort of seen people from the scientific community from all disciplines come together and work with each other at these times. We've had the artificial intelligence community, which has been doing work. I know the behavioral science community has been influencing a lot of the work in the UK, and a lot of the advice being given to government out there. So we have a lot of different disciplines, not just behavioral science, but scientists coming together at these times and working at a pace which we've never seen before, and working with, I think there's a new wave of research funding, which is at least from a New Zealand context, which has come around, and a lot of other countries are looking at investing quite heavily into R&D efforts into their own countries. So I'd love to see what comes out of our collective efforts at these times. In terms of podcasts, I do have maybe another recommendation. Dr. Rangan Chatterjee's podcast. Yeah. He does interview Gabor Mate as well, who's Dr. Gabor Mate is like my spiritual guru. So anyone who can pick up his books or pick up some of his work, I'd highly recommend. Another fun one, which I do like to listen to, and for a bit of advice on the space of wellness and well-being, is Russell Brand's podcast, Into the Skin. I'd recommend that as well.
I think for goal setting as well, like even the Think Small, so the Rory Gallagher's book and whatnot, is just like a really basic, easy, step-by-step goal setting book. Like not basic, but I mean very easy to use, and has some really great kind of ideas in research as well in terms of thinking about goals.
I'm just we can maybe have a quick look at some of the comments. There's been a few conversations. If you want to pick up, I can feed one or two questions to you.
I like the Pomodoro tracker. So that's quite interesting, because there's some work around. Sometimes it takes you 20 minutes to get into an activity. So there's a method that reminds you to concentrate for 25 minutes and then break for 5 minutes. When I was beginning my PhD, I was kind of told about this workaround. If you sit down and you just give yourself 20 minutes, you often build motivation within that 20 minutes to continue to work. So even though there's a tip for 25 and 5, I don't know if there's any work around. I'm not up to date with if there's any work comparing this, but I really find it useful to do the 50 or 55 minutes and then take a break. So regular breaks are really important, but the cadence of which you do that might depend on your workload, the cognitive kind of load that you're working on, and what works best for you. So for me, the shorter breaks, I'd probably procrastinate more by the time I got back, as opposed to the irregular but still frequent breaks are really useful. The one key thing is the breaks are really important, and you actually see that when you take frequent breaks, you not only feel refreshed, but you do get like that's when you kind of get your more creative ideas and a more kind of productive because of that. So that's why people talk about sometimes their best ideas come from the shower and things, because it's when you're giving yourself permission to just think and not be kind of distracted by other things.
There's a question from Sarah, a really good question. She's interested in the role of the natural world. Any recommendations of nature-based practices that can help us in this area?
Yeah, so I think this is quite interesting. So there is some work around how So I'm not as up to date on the kind of nature mental health, but broadly there's work in terms of specific researchers, whereas the rest in the kind of habitual behaviour I can tell you more about. But there is a lot around the fact that kind of taking it back to nature grounds us. So if you can touch the ground and you can kind of feel the surfaces around that ground, it can really kind of make you more free. The other thing about going outside is that you get more oxygen, right, and some level of kind of fresh air. It also puts you've got more distractions, so it can take your mind away from your current stresses. So definitely outside in that area, but I'm not like as up to date on the kind of well-being work that's in the natural world, so to speak.
Yeah, I haven't picked up some of the science part of it, but I know the value of being grounded. It's hard to I guess part of the science is very different from the kind of scientific methodologies which we have. So it's very, very hard to study some of the impacts of, having your skin touch the ground the whole time, because you don't have a control study to study being grounded. But another practice which I've picked up is just picking edible weeds and edible herbs. So when I go for a walk or go for a run, I pick up something from nature and cook with it, and you value it a bit more. But again, very hard to measure with our scientific tools, but something which I've found very useful.
The great kind of learning opportunity too, right, is to pick up something each time and go away and build, makes you more conscious about the environment, but also great to kind of keep yourself learning about new things.
Yeah, I use the Google Lens app to make sure I don't pick up something poisonous. Very useful to identify objects which you're not familiar with. Awesome. I think we're wrapping out of time. Thanks, Juliette, for joining us. I've been hoping to get you down to New Zealand for a while to talk to the behavioral science community out here, but it's awesome that you've been able to do this.
Well, thanks for having me. And I know that I kept it really broad, so if you've got some specific questions or any kind of researchers, please let me know. I just kind of felt that it was better to kind of be more broad, and then we can kind of go into specific ideas. So awesome. I'm just looking at the last one, the lunar calendar. One thing that I might say is someone recently spoke to me. Don't know if this is at all scientifically proven, but something to think about is outdoors in nature is whether or not our body reacts to the tides and the currents and whatnot, because we're kind of water-based. I'm not sure, but I thought that was something interesting. If anyone's thinking through different mental health and wellbeing strategies in nature, it might be interesting to look at how it's kind of more of a scientific approach to thinking about how our body reacts to the environment, just like kind of trees and animals do to some extent.
Thanks, Juliette. It's been a real pleasure talking to you, and it's been a very insightful conversation. Thank you, everyone else, for joining us and for being part of this conversation and this discussion. Having a meaningful discussion with you all is why I love doing this, and being connected with all of you and starting and creating lasting connections out of this is something which I totally enjoy doing, and thank you for all being there. That's everything from us. Be kind, keep safe, and stay curious.